welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be doing part 2 of making a wood round sign. So last week was part 1, and I will leave that video link in the description if you didn't see it. In today's video, we are going to be applying the stencil from last week's video that we made, and we'll be painting the wood round and finishing it up. So if that is something that you're interested in, let's get started. Okay, it's the next day and the wood round has been sitting overnight. When I run my hand over it, it feels dry. It doesn't feel oily. There's not any residue coming off of it onto my hand. So I think I'm ready to go to the next step. So the next step for me is I apply a thin layer of polyacrylic. So I apply this thin layer, I let it sit for a couple hours before I put my stencil onto the wood round. I just feel like it helps the process when it comes to applying the stencil, and then when I peel up the stencil, wood pieces don't come off with the stencil. I've noticed on certain woods, especially softer woods, when I go to peel the stencil or vinyl off, some strips of the wood will come off because it's a super soft wood. So the polyacrylic helps to kind of seal everything in before I put the stencil on. So I'm going to do that, let it sit, and then we'll put the stencil on.
I apply the polyacrylic using a sponge brush. I usually get mine from Harbor Freight in a big pack, and I try to do 1 to 2 passes with a sponge brush. I don't want to do too many passes in the same area or else the polyacrylic will get gummy or streaky. And I also make sure to get the sides with the polyacrylic so that there are no drip marks when it dries.
Cutting. So I am using the Oramask 813 masking film, my stencil film that I talk about. I really like this product, so that is what I'm using for this wood round sign, and I'm going to get cutting because the weeding is going to take some time. A good tip when you're trying to take vinyl off of a cutting mat so that the vinyl doesn't curl up, you're gonna flip your mat over and peel the mat away from your vinyl stencil so it won't bubble anything up.
Once the stencil is done cutting from the Cricut, I like to cut away all the excess vinyl. So in this case, I made sure to also cut around the interior part of the stencil so that I can apply not just the outer circle wording, but also the center stencil all in one so that I only have to paint everything once and I don't have to wait for anything to dry and then reapply stencil or cover any other areas. So that's just something that I like to do. And I just get everything weeded, and then I am ready to put the stencil onto the wood round. I like to make sure everything is going to line up before I put the transfer tape on in case I have to end up recutting anything because I measured something wrong. So I am using the masking transfer tape that I get from Expressions Vinyl. I will link it in the description box. I end up trimming the transfer tape just like I trim the vinyl around the stencil, and I get ready to line it up on the wood round before I apply the actual stencil. And this part is always the most stressful when I have to measure the stencil and make sure everything is aligned properly and straight. So definitely take your time and make sure everything is lined up. And you'll see here, I do trim the ends of both stencils so that they line up. And like the stencil, when I made it in Cricut Design Space, I made sure that one of the sides for each side lined up so that here, when I am applying the stencil, I make sure that if those two sides are lined up, then I know I'm good to go. So once I have that, then to hold it in place, I just take extra scrap transfer tape to hold it in place, and I do my measurements to make sure that everything is aligned and good to go. And then from there, I am ready to actually attach the stencil. So what I do is I tape the stencil down and in the middle of whatever size stencil I have, and then you can see that I'm going to peel back the first half of the stencil up until the tape, and then I'll remove the backing and then apply the stencil down. Then I'll remove that transfer tape that's holding it in place and adhere the second part. And then that way I know that nothing has moved, everything will stay in line just how I had it. And it really helps when you're trying to make sure that things stay centered. I make sure everything is burnished really well before I remove the transfer tape from the stencil, and I just slowly peel back the transfer tape to make sure that none of the stencil peels up with it. And then I will smooth all of the stencil down before I do anything else. And I'm going to do the same thing with the middle piece. I am going to measure it, make sure that everything is centered, and then I will apply the transfer tape down the center of the stencil, and I will peel back the top part and adhere it, and then I will do the same thing with the bottom. And again, it just ensures that everything stays in place and I don't have to worry about measuring it once I've done it for the first time. Now I'm going to use painter's tape and tape off any area of exposed wood, because I can kind of be a messy stenciler, so if that's even a word. So I try and tape off all of the areas of exposed wood so that if I do get out of the stencil, then I'm not going to ruin the wood round. So here I apply another thin layer of polyacrylic to the top of the stencil, and this acts as like a sealer. A lot of people use Mod Podge to prevent bleeding. I have not had great success with using Mod Podge, so I prefer using the polyacrylic as my sealer to prevent bleeding when I have a stained wood round. I'm going to finish applying this, and I let it sit for a good hour or two before I apply paint. And in this case, I'm going to use a roller to apply the paint because it's such a large surface. So I do very thin layers of paint with the roller. I do not press hard at all. I press very lightly to also help with preventing any bleeding. So I applied 2 or 3 coats of this paint, and the paint that I am using is actually just house paint from Walmart. It is, the color is antique white, and if I can find it online at Walmart, I will link it below. But yeah, this is just regular house paint, and once everything has the nice even coats, then I'm going to let it dry just a little bit before I start to peel back the stencil. I don't let it dry fully. It's just personal preference. I find it easier to remove the stencil when the paint is not fully dry. So I'm just going to remove the stencil, and once the main part of the stencil is done, then I let it sit fully before I weed out the centerpieces so I don't accidentally smudge the paint. I did want to point out here that it looks like I'm pulling really hard with the stencil, but I'm really not pulling hard to get rid of the stencil because I don't want to accidentally peel up any of the words by accident when I pull up the stencil, which is why I have the scissors with me. So I will pull the stencil gently, and when it starts to give me resistance, then I will cut it so that I don't peel anything else up. That also helps with the softer wood too. I won't peel up as much of the wood from the stencil either if I'm just gently pulling, and then like I said, if there's resistance, then I will cut it and start pulling somewhere else. Like I said before, I wait for the paint to be fully dry before I weed out the center pieces because I tend to rest my hand on the surface and I just don't want to smudge any of the paint. So I'm just going to weed this, and I don't dig the weeding tool into the wood or the stencil because you'll see those marks in the wood. I mean, it's going to happen, on some pieces, but I really try not to do it for every single interior letter. So I just carefully try and peel up, a corner piece before I lift the rest of that stencil piece up to help from digging into the wood. The wood round has sat for 24 hours and dried, and I spray a light coat of polyacrylic and let that dry before I use a sponge brush with the polyacrylic for the rest of the top coats, just in case there are any issues with applying the polyacrylic with a sponge brush and it smears the paint. That has happened to me before, so now I always just do a thin coat of the spray polyacrylic before I do my other layers of the regular polyacrylic. The last steps for this wood sign is doing one coat of the polyacrylic on the back, letting that dry, and then adding the hooks. I use D hooks on the back of these wood round signs. I get them from Amazon. I think it's a pack of 50. I'll link them in the description. And I line them up with the lines on this pressed board. They're really easy to see once you're actually looking at it. So I follow the line and I go about 3 inches in on each side.
Okay, what did you guys think of making this wood round sign? If you guys plan on making your own wood round sign, leave it in the comments. I'd love to know what you're gonna make, if you're gonna try and do the same stencil or you're gonna do something else. If you liked this style video, like the 2 parts, please also let me know in the comments. I'll make more like this, or if you would like it all in one longer video, I can do that as well. So I would love to know what style video you guys would prefer. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye!